"He's in the wrong room," someone said. "The kitchen staff meets downstairs." The words cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp and dismissive. They hung in the polished conference room where 50 of the company's most powerful executives sat in leather chairs that cost more than most people made in a month. The speaker, a woman in a pristine navy suit with perfectly manicured nails, didn't even bother to look up from her tablet as she delivered the cutting remark. Elias Moore stood silently in the back of the conference hall, his weathered hands gripping a manila folder that had seen better days. The folder's edges were soft from handling, the corners bent from being carried in the pocket of work jackets through countless shifts. His clothes told a story that everyone in this room recognized but chose to ignore. Faded denim shirt with tiny holes near the collar, khaki pants that had been washed so many times they'd lost their original color, and steel-toed boots that bore the scars of 23 years in factories and warehouses. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting every line that hard work and heartbreak had carved there. At 51, Elias looked older than his years. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver. His skin bore the permanent tan of someone who'd spent decades under industrial lighting, and his hands, God, his hands told the whole story. They were the hands of a man who'd built things, fixed things, lifted things, bled for things, calloused, scarred, honest hands that had never known the softness of pushing papers or making deals. Several executives whispered and laughed among themselves, their voices carrying that particular brand of cruelty that comes from absolute certainty in one's own superiority. They spoke about him as if he couldn't hear, as if he were invisible, as if 23 years of making their success possible had rendered him transparent. "Security really needs to tighten up," muttered David Rothschild, the chief financial officer, adjusting his silk tie that probably cost more than Elias made in a week. "These people think they can just wander in anywhere these days." Margaret Chen, the VP of Operations, leaned toward him with a smirk that never reached her cold eyes. "Probably here to complain about overtime again. They never understand that business decisions are made by people who understand business." "Or he's lost," chuckled another voice from the crowd. "Happens all the time. They see the fancy building and think they belong here." The laughter that followed was soft but cutting, the kind of laughter that comes from people who've never questioned their place in the world's hierarchy. It was the sound of privilege protecting itself, of power maintaining its distance from the very people who made that power possible. Elias heard every word, every single word. But this wasn't the first time. Lord knows, it wasn't even the 100th time. He'd been hearing variations of these same dismissals his entire adult life. In bank offices, when he'd tried to get loans to start his own business, only to be told that people like him weren't good investment risks. At parent-teacher conferences, where other parents would slide away when they realized his daughter's father worked with his hands instead of his mind. At company holiday parties he'd been required to attend, where he'd stand against the wall watching executives celebrate profits generated by his labor and the labor of people like him. The sting never dulled, but he'd learned to swallow it. He'd learned to let it settle in his stomach like acid, burning but contained. More importantly, he'd learned to let it fuel something deeper, something patient and calculating that most people in this room would never understand. The Burlington Industries headquarters was a monument to corporate success. 60 floors of gleaming steel and glass reaching toward the sky like a middle finger extended at the working class below. The lobby was all marble and mirrors, designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of their place in the grand scheme of things. The executive floors were even more impressive, or oppressive, depending on your perspective. With their imported Italian leather furniture, original artwork, and windows that offered commanding views of the city sprawling below. This particular conference room was on the 58th floor, the executive level where the real decisions were made. The table was a single piece of mahogany that had probably cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by chairs that whispered when you sat in them, as if even the furniture was expensive enough to demand respect. The walls were lined with portraits of previous CEOs. All men, all white, all wearing the same expression of entitled confidence that came from never having to wonder where their next meal was coming from. The irony wasn't lost on Elias that this meeting was happening in a room paid for by the sweat and sacrifice of people who would never be allowed to set foot in it under normal circumstances. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the room and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Even the dust looked expensive here. Outside, the city was waking up. Far below, people were heading to jobs that would barely pay their bills, riding packed subway cars and buses, grabbing coffee that cost half an hour's wages, all so they could spend 8 or 10 or 12 hours making money for people like the ones in this room. Burlington Industries manufactured everything from automotive parts to household appliances, with factories scattered across the Midwest, like scattered seeds of American industrial might. The company employed over 50,000 people directly and supported hundreds of thousands more through its supply chain and contractor network. It was the kind of American success story that politicians loved to talk about during election season. A company that had grown from humble beginnings to become a cornerstone of the manufacturing economy. What they didn't talk about were the workers who'd been laid off to boost quarterly profits, the safety violations that had been covered up to avoid regulatory fines, the pension funds that had been raided to pay for executive bonuses, or the families that had been destroyed by a corporate culture that viewed human beings as interchangeable parts in a vast machine designed to generate wealth for the few. The executives filing into the room that morning represented the best and brightest of American corporate leadership, at least according to their business school rankings and compensation packages. There was Margaret Chen, who'd earned her MBA from Wharton and had spent the last 15 years climbing the corporate ladder by stepping on the backs of anyone who got in her way. Her specialty was operational efficiency, which was corporate speak for figuring out how to squeeze more productivity out of fewer people. David Rothschild sat near the front, his Harvard MBA diploma no doubt hanging prominently in his corner office 3 floors up. As CFO, he was the architect of the financial strategies that had made Burlington Industries so profitable. Strategies that included moving production to countries with cheaper labor, automating away American jobs, and finding creative ways to avoid paying taxes while accepting government subsidies. There was Jennifer Walsh, the chief marketing officer, whose job was to spin Burlington's public image into something palatable for consumers who might otherwise be bothered by the company's business practices. She was particularly good at crafting press releases that made layoffs sound like strategic restructuring, and safety violations sound like learning opportunities, and dozens of others, each one a success story in their own right, each one having earned their place at this table through intelligence, ambition, and a carefully cultivated ability to sleep soundly at night, despite the human cost of their decisions. They were all here for the quarterly board meeting, an event that would determine the fate of thousands of employees based on PowerPoint presentations and spreadsheet calculations. The agenda was typical for such meetings: review financial performance, discuss cost-cutting measures, approve executive compensation packages, and plan strategies for the coming quarter that would inevitably involve finding new ways to do more with less. None of them had any idea that the man standing silently in the back of the room had been studying every one of them for years. Elias knew Margaret Chen had 3 children and a husband who worked as a pediatric surgeon. He knew she lived in a $12 million house in Connecticut and sent her kids to private schools that cost more per year than most of his coworkers made in 5 years. He knew she drove a different luxury car to work each day of the week and had never once visited any of the factories where Burlington's products were actually made. He knew David Rothschild collected vintage wines and had a standing reservation at Le Bernardin every Friday night. He knew Rothschild had personally signed off on the decision to close the Michigan plant that had employed 800 people, including Elias's brother-in-law, who'd worked there for 18 years before being told his services were no longer needed with 3 weeks' notice. He knew Jennifer Walsh had been featured in Forbes magazine as one of the 40 under 40 most influential marketing executives in America. He knew she'd crafted the press release that described the deaths of 2 workers in the Ohio facility as workplace incidents, rather than the entirely preventable accidents they'd been, caused by safety equipment that hadn't been replaced because it wasn't cost-effective. But none of them knew him. Despite 23 years of working for their company, despite being one of their most productive employees, despite having submitted dozens of suggestions that had saved the company millions of dollars, none of them had ever bothered to learn his name. That was about to change. The whispers continued around the room as more executives filed in, each one taking their assigned seat at the great mahogany table. Coffee was being served by actual waitstaff, not the cafeteria workers from downstairs, but professional servers who'd been hired specifically for executive meetings. The coffee was imported, organic, fair trade, the kind that cost $20 a pound and came with a story about sustainable farming practices that made the executives feel good about their consumption choices. "Maybe he's here to fix something," suggested Thomas Martinez, the chief technology officer, glancing toward Elias with a kind of casual indifference reserved for service workers. "The air conditioning was acting up yesterday." "On a Sunday morning?" Margaret Chen raised an eyebrow. "More likely he's lost, or looking for work." You know how they get when word spreads about possible layoffs. The word layoffs was dropped casually, like discussing the weather, even though it represented the destruction of hundreds of lives, families, dreams. To the people in this room, layoffs were numbers on a spreadsheet, variables in an equation designed to maximize shareholder value. They were strategic decisions made by intelligent people who understood the bigger picture. To Elias, layoffs were his neighbor Mike, who'd worked in the packaging department for 12 years before being told his job was being automated away. Mike, who'd had to sell his house and move his family into a 2-bedroom apartment. Mike, who'd started drinking too much and whose marriage had fallen apart under the stress of unemployment and financial ruin. Layoffs were Sarah Thompson from Quality Control, a single mother of 3 who'd been let go during the restructuring 6 months ago. Sarah, who'd had to pull her kids out of after-school programs she could no longer afford. Sarah, who now worked 2 part-time jobs without benefits, making less in 60 hours a week than she'd made in 40 at Burlington. Layoffs were his own brother-in-law, Tony, who'd put in 18 years at the Michigan plant before being handed a cardboard box and escorted out by security. Tony, who'd spent 6 months sending out resumes before finally taking a job at Walmart that paid half what he'd been making at Burlington. Tony, whose son had to quit college because they could no longer afford tuition. But to the people in this room, layoffs were just business. "I heard they're planning another round of cuts in the second quarter," someone whispered near the front of the room. "Something about maximizing efficiency before the merger talks heat up." "Makes sense," David Rothschild nodded approvingly. "Clean up the balance sheet, show improved margins, standard procedure." Standard procedure, the casual way he said it, as if destroying people's livelihoods was as routine as ordering lunch, made Elias's jaw clench involuntarily. These people lived in a world where human suffering was measured in basis points and quarterly earnings reports. The folder in Elias's hands contained documents that would change everything, but he wasn't ready to reveal them yet, not until the perfect moment. He'd learned patience the hard way, through decades of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. That patience was about to pay dividends that none of these executives could imagine. Near the front of the room, James Wellington was reviewing his notes for the meeting. As CEO, Wellington was the king of this particular mountain, the man whose vision and leadership had transformed Burlington Industries from a regional manufacturer into a global powerhouse. His biography, prominently displayed on the company website, told the story of a self-made man who'd worked his way up from humble beginnings to the pinnacle of corporate success. What the biography didn't mention was that Wellington's humble beginnings included a trust fund from his grandfather's steel fortune, an Ivy League education paid for by family money, and connections that had opened doors throughout his career. His self-made success had been built on a foundation of privilege that most people could never dream of accessing. Wellington was reviewing the morning's agenda when his assistant, a nervous young man named Bradley who'd graduated from Northwestern 6 months ago, leaned over to whisper something in his ear. Wellington glanced up, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Elias standing in the back. For just a moment, something flickered across Wellington's face. Not recognition exactly, but awareness that something was different about this morning. Then he returned to his notes, dismissing whatever instinct had momentarily troubled him. If Wellington had trusted that instinct, if he'd acted on that moment of uncertainty, things might have gone differently. But men like Wellington didn't get where they were by listening to uncomfortable intuitions. They got there by maintaining absolute confidence in their right to be there, by never questioning the systems that had elevated them, by never acknowledging the possibility that those systems might someday be turned against them. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the conference room. Outside, the city was fully awake now. Traffic moved through the streets, below like blood through arteries, carrying people to jobs they couldn't afford to lose, people who would spend their day making money for other people. People who understood that in the grand economic equation, they were variables, not constants. Inside the conference room, the final executives were taking their seats. 50 of the most powerful people in American manufacturing, representing billions in assets and hundreds of thousands of jobs, all gathering to make decisions that would ripple through communities across the country. And in the back of the room stood a man they'd never bothered to notice, holding a folder full of papers that would change everything. The whispers were getting louder now, more pointed. Security would be here soon if someone actually called them. But Elias had calculated this moment carefully. He knew exactly how long he had before someone would get uncomfortable enough to actually do something about his presence. "Should we call someone?" Jennifer Walsh looked around nervously. "I mean, this is supposed to be a secure meeting." "I'm sure it's fine," Margaret Chen waved dismissively. "Probably just some maintenance issue. These people know better than to cause problems." These people. The casual dehumanization was so automatic, so ingrained, that Chen probably didn't even realize she'd said it. To her, Elias wasn't a person with a name, a history, a family, dreams, fears, and ambitions. He was just these people, the faceless mass of workers who existed to serve the interests of people like her. That attitude, that casual dismissal of human dignity, had been building in Elias like pressure in a boiler for 23 years. Every ignored suggestion, every passed-over promotion, every time he'd been spoken about rather than spoken to, every safety shortcut that had put his co-workers at risk, every benefit that had been cut to pay for executive bonuses, all of it had been building toward this moment. The folder in his hands contained stock certificates, legal documents, transfer papers, and financial records that represented the culmination of a plan that had taken him 15 years to execute. A plan so patient, so carefully constructed, so thoroughly researched that none of the brilliant minds in this room had seen it coming. Because they'd never bothered to look. Elias had been buying Burlington Industries stock for 15 years. Not much at first, just a few shares here and there, whatever he could afford after paying his mortgage, his daughter's school expenses, his wife's medical bills, and the 1,000 other financial obligations that came with trying to maintain a middle-class life on a working-class salary. But he'd been patient and smart. And most importantly, he'd been paying attention. He'd noticed when Burlington's stock price was artificially depressed due to temporary market conditions. He'd watched the quarterly reports, studied the financial statements, analyzed the company's performance with the dedication of someone whose life depended on understanding how the business really worked. Because his life did depend on it. His family's life depended on it. His community's life depended on it. While the executives in this room had been focused on short-term gains and quarterly bonuses, Elias had been playing a longer game. He'd reinvested every dividend, participated in every employee stock purchase program, and slowly, methodically, quietly accumulated shares. When Burlington's stock price had crashed 18 months ago due to the safety violations and regulatory fines that the company had tried to cover up, Elias had been ready. He'd mortgaged his house, borrowed against his 401k, and used every penny of savings he'd accumulated over 2 decades to buy shares at rock-bottom prices. The executives in this room had seen the stock crash as a temporary setback, a speed bump on the road to continued profitability. They'd been confident that the stock price would recover, that the regulatory issues would blow over, that business would continue as usual. They'd been right about the recovery. The stock price had rebounded strongly over the past year as Burlington had implemented new safety protocols and settled the regulatory issues. But they'd been wrong about who would benefit from that recovery. Because during those 18 months of depressed stock prices, Elias Moore had quietly become the largest individual shareholder of Burlington Industries. And last night, less than 12 hours ago, he'd exercised his option to purchase the additional shares that gave him controlling interest in the company. The folder in his hands contained the paperwork that made him, legally and officially, the owner of Burlington Industries. But nobody in this room knew that yet. The transformation was about to begin, but first, Elias wanted them to understand exactly who they'd been dismissing all these years. He wanted them to feel, for just a moment, the powerlessness that he and his coworkers had lived with every day. He wanted them to experience the shock of having their entire world turned upside down by someone they'd never bothered to see as fully human. The morning sun continued its climb, and the shadows in the room shifted again. James Wellington stood up, straightening his Italian silk tie and checking his Rolex, a watch that cost more than most of his employees made in 6 months. Ladies and gentlemen, Wellington's voice carried the authority of someone who'd never questioned his right to command attention. Thank you all for being here this morning. We have a full agenda today, and I know everyone's time is valuable. Valuable, as if time itself had different worth depending on whose life it was measuring. Before we begin with our quarterly review, Wellington continued, his eyes scanning the room with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed, I want to address the rumors that have been circulating about potential changes in company ownership. A murmur went through the room. This wasn't on the published agenda. As you know, there have been some unusual trading patterns in our stock over the past several months. Our legal team has been investigating, and I'm pleased to report that we've identified the source of this activity. Wellington smiled, the kind of smile that came from believing you were always the smartest person in the room. It appears that we have a new major shareholder, someone who's been quietly accumulating a significant position in Burlington Industries. This morning, I'd like to introduce you to that individual and discuss what this means for our company's future. The murmur grew louder. Executives leaned toward each other, whispering speculation about which investment firm or private equity group had been buying up Burlington stock. This is actually quite exciting, Wellington continued. Fresh investment capital, new strategic partnerships, expanded growth opportunities. Exactly the kind of development that positions us for continued success in an increasingly competitive marketplace. Margaret Chen raised her hand. Jim, do we know who this new investor is? Are we talking about a friendly acquisition or something more aggressive? Excellent question, Margaret. And I'm happy to say that our new major shareholder has been nothing but cooperative throughout this process. In fact, they've requested the opportunity to address this group personally this morning. Wellington gestured toward the back of the room, and for the first time, all 50 executives turned to look directly at Elias Moore. But they still didn't see him. Not really. Their eyes moved past him, looking for the real power player, the suited executive or investment banker who would walk through the door at any moment to take control of their company. I believe our guest is here now, Wellington said, checking his watch again. We're expecting them any moment. The irony was perfect. They were looking right at their new owner and couldn't see him because he didn't fit their narrow definition of what power looked like. Elias felt a moment of profound sadness for these people, not sympathy. They'd forfeited any claim to that through years of callous indifference to human suffering. But sadness for the limited, narrow lives they'd built for themselves, lives so constrained by privilege and assumption that they literally couldn't see reality when it was standing right in front of them. The folder in his hand suddenly felt heavier, weighted with the responsibility of what was about to happen. In a few moments, he would destroy their world as completely as they'd been destroying other people's worlds for decades. The difference was that they'd had it coming. Wellington was checking his phone now, probably looking for a message from his assistant about when the mysterious new investor would arrive. The other executives were getting restless, some of them glancing at their own phones and tablets, others whispering among themselves about what this development might mean for their own positions. Perhaps there's been some miscommunication, David Rothschild suggested. Maybe we should proceed with the regular agenda and circle back to this later? No, Wellington shook his head. They were very specific about wanting to address the group this morning. Let me check with my assistant. He pressed a button on the conference room phone. Bradley? Is our guest here yet? The new shareholder who was supposed to address the board meeting? Bradley's nervous voice came through the speaker. Sir, I'm not sure. I haven't seen anyone matching the description you gave me. What description did I give you? You said to look for someone who looked like they belonged in the executive conference room, sir. The silence that followed was profound. Wellington's face went through several different expressions as his brain tried to process what his assistant had just said. "Bradley," Wellington's voice was very quiet now. "What exactly did our new shareholder tell you when they called to arrange this meeting?" "Well, sir, they said they'd be attending the board meeting this morning and that they'd introduce themselves when the time was right. They said you'd know who they were when they were ready to be known." Wellington's eyes slowly moved back toward the rear of the conference room, where Elias Moore stood silently, still holding his manila folder, still wearing his simple clothes, still looking like exactly what he was, a working man who'd spent 23 years being invisible to the people who controlled his life. But now, for the first time, James Wellington really looked at him. And in that moment of true seeing, Wellington's world began to crack. "Oh my God," Wellington whispered. The transformation had begun. What do you think happens next? Drop a comment below with your predictions. Wellington's face went through a spectrum of emotions in the span of 3 seconds: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, a creeping horror that started in his eyes and spread downward like spilled ink on white paper. "You," he breathed, the word barely audible. But Elias wasn't ready yet. Not quite. He wanted to savor this moment, to let it build the way tension builds in a violin string before it snaps. 23 years of being invisible had taught him the power of perfect timing. "Is there a problem, Jim?" Margaret Chen's voice cut through the suddenly thick air. She was still looking between Wellington and the back of the room, still not understanding what was happening. "Should we call security?" "No," Wellington said quickly, too quickly. His voice cracked slightly on the word. "No, don't call security." "But Jim, if there's some kind of—" "I said no." Wellington's snap silenced the room completely. 50 executives who were accustomed to being the most important people in any room suddenly found themselves witnesses to their CEO losing composure in a way none of them had ever seen before. David Rothschild leaned forward, his expensive suit rustling against the leather chair. "Jim, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost. The metaphor was more accurate than Rothschild could possibly know. Elias Moore had been a ghost in this company for over 2 decades, present but invisible, essential but unnoticed, real but somehow not quite real enough to matter. Wellington's hands were shaking now, just slightly, but enough that the papers he was holding rustled audibly in the dead silence of the conference room. His mind was racing, trying to process what his eyes were telling him, trying to reconcile the impossible with the inevitable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wellington's voice was steadier now, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded suspiciously like fear. "I'd like you to meet our new major shareholder." Every head in the room turned toward the back, expecting to see someone walking through the door, someone in a suit, someone who looked like them. Instead, they saw Elias Moore taking his first step forward. The sound of his work boots on the polished marble floor echoed through the conference room like gunshots. Each step was deliberate, measured, carrying the weight of 23 years of accumulated grievances and carefully planned revenge. "What is this?" Margaret Chen's voice was sharp with confusion and growing alarm. "Jim, what's happening here?" But Wellington couldn't answer because he was beginning to understand exactly what was happening, and the magnitude of it was stealing his breath away. Elias took another step. And another. The executives closest to the back of the room actually scooted their chairs forward, away from him, as if poverty and honest work were contagious diseases they might catch through proximity. "Security," someone whispered urgently. "We need to call security right now." "Nobody," Elias spoke for the first time since entering the room, his voice quiet but carrying clearly to every corner of the space, "is calling anyone." The authority in his voice, quiet, unassuming, but absolutely unshakable, stopped every conversation, every whisper, every nervous movement. For the first time in their corporate lives, these 50 executives found themselves taking orders from someone they'd never considered worthy of giving them. Jennifer Walsh, the chief marketing officer who'd made a career out of spinning corporate disasters into public relations victories, was frantically tapping on her phone. "I'm calling building security," she announced. "This is completely inappropriate." Elias smiled, and something about that smile made her fingers freeze on the phone screen. "Jennifer Walsh," he said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "Marketing degree from USC, MBA from Northwestern, joined Burlington 7 years ago. Lives in a $4.2 million house in Westchester County. Drives a Tesla, Moon Doe S, that she charges at the office because she thinks it makes her look environmentally conscious. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. Last year, you crafted the press release that described the deaths of Roberto Martinez and James Kim as workplace incidents rather than the preventable accidents they were. Roberto left behind a wife and 3 children. James was 24 years old, fresh out of community college, working his first real job to save money for his wedding. Jennifer's face had gone chalk white. Her phone slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered on the marble floor. "How?" she started to say, then stopped. "How do I know?" Elias took another step forward. "Because Roberto Martinez was my line supervisor for 6 years. Because James Kim was dating my neighbor's daughter. Because while you were crafting your carefully worded press releases, I was attending their funerals." The silence stretched like a held breath. Every executive in the room was suddenly, acutely aware that they were in the presence of something they'd never encountered before: consequence. David Rothschild cleared his throat, trying to reassert some semblance of control over the situation. "Now, see here. I don't know who you are, or how you got in here, but this is a private meeting, and you need to leave immediately." Elias turned his attention to Rothschild, and something in his gaze made the CFO's words die in his throat. "David Michael Rothschild," Elias said, his voice still conversational, still almost friendly. "Harvard MBA, class of 1995, CFO for the past 8 years. Salary of $2.4 million annually, plus bonuses that last year totaled another $3.7 million. Lives in a $14 million estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Collects vintage wines. Has a standing reservation at Le Bernardine every Friday night." Rothschild's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You personally signed off on the closure of the Michigan plant that employed 812 people. You described it as operational optimization in your report to the board. What you didn't mention was that the plant was actually profitable, just not profitable enough to satisfy your quarterly growth targets." Elias reached into his manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The rustling sound seemed unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the room. "My brother-in-law, Tony Castellano, worked at that plant for 18 years. 18 years of perfect attendance, exemplary performance reviews, and absolute loyalty to this company. When you closed the plant, he was 3 years away from full pension eligibility. 3 years. You timed the closure specifically to avoid paying out full pensions to workers like Tony." The paper in Elias's hand was shaking slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Tony had to sell his house. His son had to drop out of college. His marriage fell apart under the financial stress. Last month, at 56 years old, Tony took a job at Walmart as an overnight stocker, making $9 an hour. $9 an hour, David, for a man who spent nearly 2 decades helping to build this company's success." Rothschild had gone beyond pale into a sickly gray color. We had to make difficult decisions for the good of the company as a whole." "For the good of the company?" Elias's voice rose for the first time, and the sound made several executives flinch. "You eliminated 800 jobs to increase quarterly profits by exactly enough to trigger your performance bonus. 800 families destroyed so you could buy another vintage wine for your collection." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Margaret Chen, who'd been silent through this exchange, finally found her voice. "Look, I don't know what your problem is or what you think you're accomplishing here, but this is completely inappropriate. Security or no security, I'm not sitting here listening to some disgruntled employee's sob story." She started to stand up, but Elias's voice stopped her. "Margaret Elizabeth Chen." She froze halfway out of her chair. "Wharton MBA, 15 years with Burlington Industries, currently VP of Operations, 3 children, Michael, age 14, Sarah, age 12, and David, age 9. Husband is Dr. Richard Chen, pediatric surgeon at Mount Sinai. Combined household income last year was $4.8 million. Margaret slowly sank back into her chair. "You pioneered what you call operational efficiency initiatives. The rest of us call them something else." In the past 5 years, under your leadership, Burlington has eliminated over 3,000 jobs while increasing productivity targets by 40%. You've cut healthcare benefits, eliminated pension contributions, and reduced safety training programs, all in the name of operational efficiency. Elias pulled another paper from his folder. Maria Santos worked in the packaging department for 12 years. Single mother of 2, worked double shifts to pay for her daughter's asthma medication. When you eliminated her position last year, she lost her health insurance. Her daughter, Carmen, is 8 years old. Last month, Carmen had an asthma attack at school. Because Maria couldn't afford the inhaler, Carmen was hospitalized for 3 days. The room was so quiet that the sound of Margaret Chen's rapid breathing seemed unnaturally loud. The hospitalization cost $14,000. Maria had to declare bankruptcy. She's working 2 part-time jobs now, neither with health benefits, trying to pay off medical debt while keeping her daughter alive. Elias looked directly at Margaret, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute moral authority. You make more money in a single bonus payment than Maria will see in 5 years of working 80-hour weeks. Your daughter Sarah goes to private school that costs $60,000 a year. Maria's daughter Carmen goes to an overcrowded public school where the nurse's office doesn't have a spare inhaler because the district can't afford it. Margaret's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. But you've never met Maria Santos, have you, Margaret? To you, she's just a line item on a spreadsheet. Employee number 47,329. A variable in your efficiency calculations. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Thomas Martinez, the chief technology officer, tried to break the tension. Look, we all understand that business decisions affect people's lives. But we have responsibilities to shareholders To shareholders, Elias interrupted, and for the first time, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Yes, let's talk about shareholders. He reached into his folder again, this time pulling out a thick stack of documents bound with a blue legal cover. Burlington Industries currently has 47 million shares outstanding. As of Friday's closing, the stock was trading at $68.43 per share, giving the company a market capitalization of approximately $3.2 billion. The executives looked at each other uncertainly. This wasn't the conversation they'd expected to be having with a maintenance worker or whoever they thought Elias was. The largest institutional shareholders are, in order, Vanguard Group with approximately 8%, BlackRock with 6.3%, and State Street Global with 4.8%. The largest individual shareholders are, in order, James Wellington with 2.4%, the Wellington Family Trust with 1.8%, and David Rothschild with 1.2%. James Wellington's face had gone from gray to green. He was beginning to understand where this was going, and the destination terrified him. Those numbers are accurate as of market close on Friday, Elias continued. However, there was some significant trading activity over the weekend that hasn't been publicly reported yet. He opened the blue-bound document and pulled out several pages of stock certificates and transfer documents. At approximately 11:47 p.m. last night, I exercised my option to purchase an additional 12 million shares of Burlington Industries stock at $42 per share. The sound of 50 executives suddenly inhaling at the same time was like a windstorm rushing through the conference room. This purchase, combined with the shares I've been accumulating over the past 15 years, gives me ownership of approximately 26.3 million shares of Burlington Industries stock. Wellington's voice was barely a whisper. 26 million shares. Which represents, Elias continued, his voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of ownership, approximately 56% of all outstanding shares, a controlling interest. The silence that followed was the sound of 50 powerful people simultaneously realizing that their world had just ended. As of 11:47 last night, Elias said, I became the majority owner of Burlington Industries. Margaret Chen made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. But that's... David Rothschild's voice trailed off as his mind tried to calculate what Elias had just told them. That's over $1 billion. You can't. There's no way. You're absolutely right, David. I couldn't afford to pay cash for that many shares, so I arranged financing. Elias pulled out another document, this one with the letterhead of Goldman Sachs. It turns out that when you own a controlling interest in a profitable manufacturing company, banks are very willing to lend you money using that controlling interest as collateral. Goldman Sachs was happy to provide a credit facility of $1.2 billion at prime plus 2%. The room was spinning now, reality shifting so fundamentally that none of these executives could find their footing. But the mathematics are actually quite elegant, Elias continued. Burlington Industries generates approximately $400 million in annual free cash flow. Even after paying the interest on the loan, there's more than enough cash flow to service the debt while funding the operational changes I have in mind. Wellington finally found his voice. This is impossible. The SEC, there are disclosure requirements. You can't just... Actually, I can. And I did. All the proper forms have been filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The disclosure requirements have been met. The transaction is completely legal and binding. Elias smiled again, and this time there was something almost gentle about it. I should mention that I had excellent legal representation. The law firm of Craveth, Swaine, Moore handled the transaction. I believe you know them, Jim. They're the same firm Burlington uses for major acquisitions. Wellington's face crumpled. Cravath was his firm, his lawyers, people he'd worked with for years. The betrayal was complete. How? Jennifer Walsh's voice was barely audible. How did you get the money? How did you know about the stock movements? How did you plan all this? Elias looked at her with something that might have been pity. I've been planning this for 15 years, Jennifer. 15 years of watching you people destroy lives for quarterly bonuses. 15 years of studying your financial reports, your strategic plans, your executive compensation packages. 15 years of learning how your world works so I could use it against you. He gestured around the room, taking in the expensive furniture, the imported marble, the original artwork. You made one critical mistake. You assumed that because I work with my hands instead of pushing papers, I must be stupid. You assumed that because I wear work clothes instead of Italian suits, I must not understand how business works. You assumed that because I've never had an MBA, I must not be capable of complex financial planning. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. But I've been watching you. All of you. For 15 years, I've been studying every quarterly report, every SEC filing, every press release. I've been learning your strategies, your weaknesses, your blind spots. And the biggest blind spot you have is your absolute certainty that people like me don't matter. Margaret Chen finally found her voice. Even if this is true, even if you somehow manage to buy controlling interest, you can't just walk in here and start making demands. There are boards of directors. There are fiduciary responsibilities. There are 51% of the voting shares, Elias interrupted, which means there's me, and there's everyone else, and everyone else just became irrelevant. The reality of absolute power suddenly made itself known in the room. For the first time in their careers, these executives were face to face with someone who could make decisions about their lives the way they'd been making decisions about other people's lives for decades. And they didn't like it. This is insane, Thomas Martinez stood up abruptly. I don't care who you are or what papers you're waving around. I'm not sitting here listening to this anymore. He started toward the door, but Elias's voice stopped him. Thomas, if you leave this room, consider it your resignation. And I should mention that your employment contract includes a non-compete clause that would prevent you from working for any other technology company for 2 years. Martinez froze with his hand on the door handle. On the other hand, if you sit back down, we can discuss your future with Burlington Industries under new management, your choice. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that it was almost physically palpable. These people who'd spent their careers giving orders and making demands suddenly found themselves taking orders from someone they'd never considered worthy of their attention. Martinez slowly returned to his seat. Thank you, Elias said politely. Now, let's discuss the changes that are going to be implemented, effective immediately. He opened his folder one more time and pulled out what appeared to be a prepared agenda. First, executive compensation. The combined salaries and bonuses of the 50 executives in this room last year totaled approximately $230 million. That's more than the combined wages of the 3,000 workers whose jobs Margaret eliminated in the name of operational efficiency. Margaret flinched as if she'd been slapped. Effective immediately, executive salaries will be capped at 15 times the median worker's salary. Based on current wage levels, that means the maximum executive salary will be approximately $750,000 annually. No bonuses, no stock options, no golden parachutes. The room erupted in protests, but Elias raised his hand and silence fell immediately. Second, healthcare and benefits. Every Burlington Industries employee will receive full healthcare coverage with no deductibles, no copays, and no coverage limitations. Pension contributions will be restored to pre-2018 levels. Vacation time will be increased to 4 weeks annually for all employees, regardless of tenure. David Rothschild's voice was strangled. The cost would be enormous. It would destroy our profitability. It would reduce our profitability by approximately 12%, Elias corrected, which would still leave Burlington Industries significantly more profitable than our closest competitors. The difference is that the profits would be shared with the people who actually generate them, instead of being concentrated among the people who manage them. Third, workplace safety. All safety training programs that have been eliminated will be restored immediately. Safety equipment will be upgraded to exceed OSHA requirements, not merely meet them. Any manager who pressures workers to skip safety protocols will be terminated immediately. Jennifer Walsh was shaking her head frantically. The shareholders will never accept this. You can't just... I am the shareholders, Elias reminded her quietly. 56% of them anyway. And I'm not interested in maximizing short-term profits at the expense of human lives. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each executive individually. Fourth, plant closures and layoffs. The Michigan plant will be reopened within 6 months. Every worker who was laid off will be offered their job back at their previous salary, plus a raise to account for inflation. Workers who have found other employment will be given 6 months to make the transition back if they choose to. Wellington's voice was hoarse. The cost of reopening Michigan, it would cost hundreds of millions. It would cost approximately $60 million to reopen the Michigan plant, Elias corrected, which is less than you spent on executive bonuses last year. It's also less than Burlington Industries spends annually on marketing campaigns designed to convince people that we care about American workers. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Fifth, environmental compliance. Burlington Industries will exceed all environmental regulations by a minimum of 20%. We will invest in clean energy systems for all our facilities within 5 years. We will take responsibility for cleaning up the environmental damage we've caused in communities where we operate. Thomas Martinez was staring at Elias as if he were seeing him for the first time. You're talking about completely restructuring the entire company. The complexity. The implementation challenges. It would take years. It would take approximately 18 months to fully implement these changes, Elias said. I've had 15 years to plan this transition. Every detail has been worked out, every cost has been calculated, every potential obstacle has been anticipated. He smiled, and for the first time, it was a genuinely warm smile. You see, while you were all focused on quarterly earnings and stock prices, I was focused on building a company that could actually serve the people who work for it. A company that could be profitable while still being humane. A company that could succeed without destroying lives. The room was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. The silence of people trying to process a completely new reality. Now, Elias continued, let's talk about your futures with Burlington Industries. The tension ratcheted up again immediately. Some of you will be leaving the company, not because you're bad people, but because you've demonstrated that you're incapable of seeing employees as human beings rather than cost centers. Margaret, David, Jennifer. Your resignations will be effective at the end of this meeting. The 3 named executives looked as if they'd been physically struck. Others of you will have the opportunity to stay and help build something better. Thomas, your technology initiatives have actually been quite good when they've been focused on improving working conditions rather than eliminating jobs. I'd like you to stay and help implement some of the systems we'll need." Martinez nodded slowly, still looking stunned. "The rest of you will have 60 days to demonstrate that you can adapt to a management philosophy that values human dignity over quarterly profits. Those who can make that transition will have a place in the new Burlington Industries. Those who can't will receive generous severance packages and excellent references." Wellington raised his hand like a schoolchild, asking for permission to speak. "What about me?" he asked quietly. Elias looked at him for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly. "Jim, you're a complicated case. You're not a bad person, but you've been a bad leader. You've allowed this company to become something that destroys the lives of the people who work for it. But you also built something impressive, and there might be a place for you in what comes next." Wellington's eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. "I'd like you to stay for now. Not as CEO, that position is being eliminated, but as a senior advisor. Help me understand the parts of this business that I don't know yet. Help me avoid the mistakes that good intentions can sometimes lead to." "And if I refuse?" Wellington asked. "Then you'll receive a severance package worth $50 million and an excellent reference letter. But Jim, I hope you'll stay. Because I think you remember what it was like to believe that business could be a force for good in the world. I think you remember what it was like to care about the people who work for you, not just the people who invest in you." Wellington nodded slowly, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. "I do remember," he whispered. "Good," Elias said gently. "Then let's see if we can build something worth remembering." He looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of 50 people whose lives had just been turned upside down as completely as they'd been turning other people's lives upside down for years. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new Burlington Industries. Tomorrow, we start building a company that proves you don't have to choose between profitability and humanity. A company that demonstrates that the best way to create shareholder value is to first create value for the people who do the work." The morning sun had climbed high enough now that it was streaming directly through the conference room windows, casting everything in sharp, clear light. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in this one room, the entire relationship between capital and labor had just been rewritten. Elias Moore, the invisible man who'd spent 23 years being overlooked and underestimated, had just become the most powerful person in American manufacturing. And he was just getting started. The revolution has begun. What did you think of this incredible power shift? Could this actually happen in real life? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The silence that followed Elias's declaration stretched for what felt like an eternity. 50 of the most powerful people in American manufacturing sat frozen in their leather chairs, their world fundamentally altered in the span of 30 minutes by a man they'd never bothered to notice. Margaret Chen was the first to break. The woman who'd built her career on operational efficiency, corporate speak for treating human beings like disposable resources, suddenly found herself face to face with the human cost of her decisions. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she reached for her briefcase. Her voice cracked. "I need to call my lawyer." "You can call anyone you want, Margaret," Elias said quietly. "But the decisions have been made. Your resignation is effective immediately." She stood on unsteady legs, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor as she walked toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back, her face a mask of disbelief and something that might have been shame. "You don't understand what you're doing," she whispered. "The complexity of running a company like this. You'll destroy everything we've built." Elias met her gaze steadily. "Margaret, what you built was a machine that ground up human lives to produce quarterly profits. If I destroy that, the world will be a better place." She flinched as if he'd struck her, then walked out without another word. David Rothschild was next. The Harvard MBA who'd spent 8 years treating plant closures and layoffs like mathematical equations stood slowly, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face ashen. "The Michigan plant," he said, his voice barely audible. "When you reopen it, will you tell them? Will you tell Tony Castellano that I'm sorry?" The question hung in the air like a prayer seeking forgiveness. "You can tell him yourself, David," Elias replied. "He'll be one of the first people I call when we start rehiring." Rothschild nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I forgot," he whispered. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot that the numbers represented people. Real people with families and dreams, and—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Elias said, and there was genuine compassion in his voice. "The system makes it easy to forget. That's why we're going to change the system." Rothschild walked to the door, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I hope you succeed. I hope you build something better than what we created." Then he was gone, leaving 48 executives and one revolutionary in the aftermath of corporate upheaval. Jennifer Walsh, the marketing executive who'd spent years crafting press releases that turned human tragedies into public relations opportunities, sat staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red with unshed tears. "Roberto Martinez," she said quietly. "James Kim. I wrote their stories as if they were statistics instead of people. Their families. Did their families see those press releases?" "Roberto's wife, Carmen, did," Elias answered. "She told me it felt like you were erasing her husband's life, turning his death into something clean and corporate instead of the preventable tragedy it was." Jennifer's breath caught in her throat. "I have children," she whispered. "If something happened to me, if someone wrote about my death the way I wrote about theirs—" She couldn't continue. "You can't undo what you wrote, Jennifer," Elias said gently. "But you can choose to do better going forward." "How?" The word came out as a sob. "How do I live with what I've done?" "By making sure it never happens again. By using your skills to tell the truth instead of hiding it. By remembering that every story you tell is about someone's life, someone's family, someone's dreams." She nodded through her tears, gathered her things, and left the room with the weight of genuine remorse heavy on her shoulders. The remaining executives sat in stunned silence, each one processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Some were calculating the financial implications. Others were wondering about their own job security. But a few, just a few, were beginning to understand that they'd been complicit in a system that treated human suffering as acceptable collateral damage for corporate success. Thomas Martinez, the chief technology officer, was the first to speak. "The automation projects," he said slowly. "The ones designed to eliminate jobs. I always told myself we were making the company more efficient, more competitive. But really, we were just making it easier to profit from other people's work without having to employ as many people." Elias nodded. "Technology should make work better, not eliminate workers. Can you design systems that make jobs safer, more fulfilling, more productive, while keeping the people who do those jobs?" "Yes," Martinez said with growing conviction. "Yes, absolutely. I've had ideas for years about how to do exactly that, but they were always rejected because they didn't reduce headcount. Then let's start there. Show me what's possible when technology serves workers instead of replacing them." One by one, the remaining executives began to engage with the new reality. Some were skeptical, others were frightened, but several were beginning to see possibilities they'd never been allowed to explore. Ways to run a business that succeeded by lifting people up instead of grinding them down. James Wellington sat quietly through all of this, his face a map of decades spent making decisions he'd never fully examined. Finally, when the room had settled into something resembling normalcy, he spoke. 28 years ago," he said, his voice soft but clear, "when I first became CEO, I had a vision of Burlington Industries as a company that would prove American manufacturing could compete globally while still taking care of American workers. I was going to show the world that you didn't have to choose between profitability and humanity." He paused, lost in memories of younger idealism. "Somewhere along the way, I lost that vision. The quarterly pressure, the analyst calls, the constant demand for higher margins. I started making compromises, small ones at first. Just temporary measures, I told myself. But each compromise made the next one easier until eventually I was running exactly the kind of company I'd originally set out to replace." Wellington looked directly at Elias, and in his eyes was a mixture of shame, regret, and something that might have been hope. You've done something I should have done years ago. You've remembered that companies exist to serve people, not the other way around. If you'll have me, I'd like to help you build what I should have built when I had the chance." Elias studied the older man for a long moment. Wellington represented everything that had gone wrong with American capitalism. The good intentions corrupted by system incentives, the gradual erosion of values in pursuit of metrics, the slow transformation of leaders into mere maximizers of shareholder value. But he also represented the possibility of redemption. "Jim," Elias said finally, "I'm going to ask you to do something that might be the hardest thing you've ever done." "What's that?" "I want you to call a press conference for this afternoon. I want you to stand in front of the business media and tell them exactly what you just told me. I want you to admit that Burlington Industries has been harming the very people who made its success possible. I want you to announce the changes we're implementing, and I want you to take personal responsibility for the years of damage that's been done." The room went dead silent. A public admission of corporate wrongdoing, especially from a sitting CEO, was virtually unprecedented in the business world. Wellington's face went through a series of expressions: fear, calculation, resistance, before settling into something resembling peace. "You want me to commit corporate suicide," he said quietly. "I want you to commit corporate honesty. There's a difference." Wellington was quiet for a long time, considering. The smart play, the safe play, would be to refuse. Take the severance package, retire quietly, preserve his reputation and his legacy. Let someone else take the blame for the changes that were coming. But looking around the room at the faces of his fellow executives, people who'd spent their careers optimizing human misery for financial gain, Wellington realized that his reputation and legacy were already compromised. The only question was whether he'd end his career as part of the problem or part of the solution. "When do you want to hold the press conference?" he asked. 3 o'clock this afternoon. That gives us time to prepare a statement and notify the media." Wellington nodded slowly. "What will you say? About the ownership change, I mean?" "The truth. That a worker who'd been ignored for 23 years spent 15 years patiently acquiring enough stock to take control of the company. That sometimes the people you dismiss as irrelevant turn out to be the most relevant people of all. They'll want to know how you financed the acquisition. And I'll tell them." Goldman Sachs was happy to provide financing once they realized that treating workers fairly actually improves long-term profitability. It's amazing how much more productive people are when they're not constantly worried about losing their jobs or their health care. Wellington smiled for the first time that day. "The business press is going to go crazy." "Good. Let them. Maybe it's time for American business to have a conversation about what success actually means." As the meeting began to wind down, executives slowly filed out of the conference room. Some left with anger, others with resignation, a few with something approaching hope. But all of them left with the understanding that the world they'd known, the world where workers were costs to be minimized and human suffering was acceptable collateral damage for quarterly profits, was over. Thomas Martinez lingered after the others had gone, approaching Elias with something resembling excitement in his eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said, about technology serving workers instead of replacing them. I have some ideas, some projects that could revolutionize how we approach manufacturing. Things that could make jobs safer, more interesting, more fulfilling, while actually increasing productivity." "Show me," Elias said simply. Martinez pulled out his tablet and began scrolling through files. "Here. This is a system I designed that would allow workers to control manufacturing processes through augmented reality interfaces. Instead of replacing human judgment with algorithms, it enhances human judgment with real-time data and predictive analytics." Elias leaned forward, genuinely interested. For 15 years, he'd been studying the company from the outside. Now he was beginning to understand it from the inside. "And this," Martinez continued, "is a proposal for redesigning factory floors to reduce repetitive stress injuries while increasing output quality. The current setup prioritizes speed over sustainability, but with some modifications, we could have both." "How long would implementation take?" 6 months for the pilot program, maybe 18 months for full deployment across all facilities. "The upfront costs would be significant, But the long-term benefits, reduced injury rates, improved product quality, higher worker satisfaction, would more than justify the investment. "Do it," Elias said without hesitation. Martinez blinked. "Just like that?" "Thomas, for the past 8 years you've been asking permission to make workers' lives better, and you've been told no because it didn't immediately reduce costs. You don't need permission anymore. You need results. Show me that technology can serve humanity instead of enslaving it." As Martinez left, energized by possibilities he'd never been allowed to explore, James Wellington remained behind. The two men, one who'd spent decades at the top of the corporate hierarchy, one who'd spent decades at the bottom, sat in the empty conference room as afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. "Can I ask you something?" Wellington said quietly. "Of course. When did you first decide to do this? When did you first realize you were going to take over the company?" Elias was quiet for a moment, remembering. 15 years ago, my wife, Maria, was diagnosed with cancer. Stage 3, but treatable. The insurance company, our insurance company, Burlington's insurance company, denied coverage for the experimental treatment her doctor recommended. They said it was investigational and not covered under our policy. Wellington's face tightened with understanding. Maria died 18 months later. Not because the cancer was incurable, but because we couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved her. I spent our entire savings, mortgaged our house, borrowed against my 401 EC, but it wasn't enough. She died because your insurance company decided her life wasn't worth the cost of treatment. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and guilt. After the funeral, Elias continued, I was going through Maria's things, and I found a notebook where she'd been calculating our expenses, trying to figure out how we could afford her treatment. On the last page, she'd written something that changed my life. What did she write? She wrote, Elias, if I don't make it, promise me you'll find a way to make sure this doesn't happen to other families. Promise me you'll use your pain to prevent other people's pain. Promise me you'll fight for people who can't fight for themselves. Wellington's eyes filled with tears. That night, I started buying Burlington stock, one share at a time whenever I could afford it. I told myself I was investing in my daughter's future, but really, I was preparing for war. And now the war is over. Now we build peace. Wellington nodded slowly. What happens next? Next, we prove that American business can be both profitable and humane. We show the world that taking care of workers isn't charity, it's good business. We demonstrate that companies that treat people with dignity outperform companies that treat people as disposable resources. And if we fail? Elias smiled, and in that smile was the confidence of someone who'd already won the only victory that mattered. Jim, I've already succeeded. I've taken a company that was destroying lives and turned it into a company that will save lives. Everything else is just details. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, casting the conference room in brilliant light, the two men, former adversaries, now unlikely, allies, began planning the press conference that would announce to the world that the age of purely extractive capitalism was ending, and the age of regenerative capitalism was beginning. In a few hours, business reporters would scramble to understand how a factory worker had quietly accumulated enough stock to take control of a Fortune 500 company. Financial analysts would debate the implications of prioritizing worker welfare over quarterly profits. Corporate executives across America would wonder if their own ignored employees might be planning similar revolutions. But in that moment, in that sun-drenched conference room on the 58th floor of a building built with the profits of human labor, two men who'd started the day as strangers were planning something unprecedented in American business history. A company designed to prove that success could be measured not just in dollars, but in dignity. The revolution was complete. The transformation had begun. And Maria Moore's promise was finally being kept. The ending that will make you believe again. Did Elias go too far? Or is this exactly what American business needs? This story proves that the most powerful revolutions happen quietly, patiently, and with perfect timing. If this gave you chills and made you think about power, justice, and second chances, smash that subscribe button And share this with everyone who needs to see what happens when the underdog finally wins. Drop a comment and tell me, could this actually happen in real life? Your thoughts matter.